Welcome to Postmodernity e-lecture number 2. So one of the queries we were talking about is if we think about postmodernism, if we think about postmodernity as being affiliated to a particular period, we can start to think about when that might have happened. And I think that in architecture, there's a really lovely example. So this is an example of modernist architecture from America that was literally blown up on the afternoon of the 15th of July 1972. And what it represents is a building, is an example of the work of indebted to Le Corbusier, who's a very important modernist architect, and his ideal for living, and his ideal for modern living. And what you have here is the state blowing up, demolishing this ideal housing experiment, if you like. So this is seen by some as being the failure of modernity, the failure of modernism, if you like, to provide us with everything that we need. And you can look out of the window and look at an example after Le Corbusier of Park Hill Flats and the environment that there is there, and think about how that's been changed, and perhaps through a process actually that's more akin to sort of postmodernism that's been tarted up. We've had electronic graffiti added to essentially the same buildings, and how does that make it then more livable? So in architecture, the critic Jennings talks about this sudden moment. It's not as brutal, it's not as obvious in literature, I don't think. So going back to those kind of ideas of an epoch change, we go back to those ideas about the end of the Second World War, possibly, an example like this, to kind of signal this beginning, if you like, of the post-modernity or the postmodern period in particular. So who gave us the postmodern condition? Who talked about it? Well, these cultural critics that we introduced at the top. So Lyotard, Baudrillard and Jameson. So I actually think a really useful clip that you can watch in relation to this is The Matrix. So looking in relation to ideas of reality and unreality. And a useful secondary critic, not on The Matrix, but on postmodernity in particular, is Terry Eagleton, like I've said before. I'm not going to spend too long on this because I'm actually going to introduce each of these critics to you, and I'd like you to watch that clip in your own time, and it may be something you want to do now, so take a moment. Lyotard I introduced you to when we talked about postmodernism to begin with. He's important. And as McHale says, it all begins with Lyotard, who talks to us about meta-narratives. And I've included at the middle point of this slide here the quotation that you will be sick of hearing me say, this notion of simplifying to the extreme. I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. So this idea of suspicion, not to have blind faith in the stories around us, the stories that we're told. And these kind of meta-narratives then can be broken down. It's sometimes translated as master narratives or grand narratives. So we talked about Marx, we talked about religion, ideas of governance, ideas of truth. There's no universal foundation for the truths, for the stories that we tell ourselves. So postmodern period, postmodern condition is one typified by uncertainty, a sense of loss, not knowing, or knowing and knowledge being limited. So Lyotard's report on knowledge, an important document, an important collection I've put online for you, segments from that and the other key critics as well, and it's important for you to look at it, it's important for you to to dip in and see how this quotation falls in relation to the rest of what he's saying. But for Lyotard, he's kind of bringing together those ideas of postmodernity and postmodernism, because what he's saying is that knowledge is part of this exchange mechanism. It's part of a product to be bought and to be sold and to be packaged. So think about this idea that knowledge is no longer pleasurable, it's no longer an end in itself, it exists in a system to be swapped and to be exchanged. So some of these dystopian films that you kind of come across are quite useful in this respect, and that's why I think The Matrix is quite a useful analogy for thinking about living in postmodern times, if you like. So it's a difficult quotation, but I want you to learn it. It's an important one, and you may want to use it in the exam in particular. And it would be good if you could talk around this and start to kind of unpick what he means and get a sense of what he means by master or meta-narratives and examples of those as well. So Lyotard draws our attention then to what he calls the little narrative, the importance of localised story or localised knowledge, a point of imaginative invention. It reminds us what it is we lack. It reminds us of our lack of faith, if you like, in those master narratives. And he and Derrida really explore this idea of language. So the work that Anthony was doing with you on postmodernism and language, here you can see there's another point, of comparison. So these kind of language games, we get a fragmentation of knowledge. It becomes localized or globalized to such an extent that it undermines truth, it undermines legitimacy. Technology reproduces, reperforms, recycles, rather than giving us a sense of progress and emancipation and freedom that we might have hoped for, prior to this kind of beginning of the modernity period. Here with sort of postmodernity and postmodernism, we can see that technology is purely perfunctory, reproducing menial tasks over and over again, and us being lost in that kind of system as well. So another film, Terry Gilliam's Brazil, some lovely clips from that about kind of everyday work that you might want to look at, because it gives us again a sense of being lost in a system not so dissimilar to modernity. But here what we have, I think, is replication, duplication, what we talked about in relation to recycling again. So for Lyotard, like a number of other postmodernists, we don't have a sense of originality. Everything is being recycled, knowledge is being repackaged, reformulated. We get this kind of split of genre. I'll say more about that later on, because it's a nice way, I think, of understanding ideas of the postmodern. Baudrillard, very important critic, very controversial critic as well. So we talked about his take on the Gulf War and this idea that we repeatedly see news events, so we see the real, if you like, through this displacement, through copies, through simulations as well. And he's important for thinking about the ways in which we've turned our attention to things, to ownership, and the way in which objects have become fetishized to the extent that they dominate us. It's all about our things, our mobile phone, our computer, our Facebook, our technological connections that kind of make us. So his key work, Simulacra and Simulation, from 1981, again, there's materials on Blackboard for you to dip into. But he splits this down. He talks about simulation as being a sense of kind of process, a system that repeatedly reinforces itself. And his work on simulacra is to think about repetition and the repetition of the sign and the way in which the sign is imitating. So those of you who studied language, this isn't so dissimilar for those ideas of structuralism, Saussure's arbitrary relationship between sign and signified, and between sound, if you like, and that which it represents in language, to a post-structuralist idea, where we have this kind of relationship being broken down further, ideas of the sign being lost in a series of kind of traces, if you like. And I'm slipping into kind of Derridean speak there, Derrida, who talks about language and those kind of language games in particular. Baudrillard, although I think he's a difficult critic, you might look at some of the introductory guides around popular culture. He's a key critic in relation to media as well. So those of you who've done a media A-level may already be really familiar with his work. But he talks about 4 processes of the sign and maps them, I suppose, also historically. So thinking about the ways in which society has has changed and how our use of and engagement with the sign has changed as well. So he talks initially about the way in which a sign reflects back to us a basic reality, if you like. So that very quickly, the relationship between the sign and the signified becomes distorted. So in itself, by reflecting back, a little bit like a mirror, although it appears to show us ourselves, it shows us a reflection of ourselves. It's distorted. His third process talks about this kind of inability to know or inability to represent this basic reality. So he talks about Disneyland in a way of kind of reflecting back. We go into Disneyland knowing that it is unreal, and he talks about it as being a way of kind of reaffirming then that the rest is real. So outside of Disneyland, if we can believe in Disneyland as being this kind of pocket utopia of commercialism and otherness, he's actually saying it's not that dissimilar. So it's a pretense. And he talks then about looking back to America, how then America and the relationship between the American dream resonates with kind of Disneyland as well. So that's quite a difficult concept, I think, to think about. But again, if you're interested in this or are confused by it, those textbooks around popular culture and work by John Story, I think, really break down Baudrillard's considerations of the sign in a useful way. In his fourth process, he says that the sign has become completely dislocated from reality. It is pure reproduction, it is pure copy. So actually, my example earlier on of Fight Club and Tyler Durden kind of photocopying and re-experience his life over and over again is really important. And I think that can be shown quite beautifully in reality TV. So this collapse, if you like, of the real and that which it represents. So almost that kind of ultimate reality being this kind of reality TV program that shows us actually that we've become completely disengaged, and that we only are left with ideas of copy. So I've said a little bit about those two theorists. I'm going to pause there now and let you watch the kind of Made in Chelsea clip. The third section, we will look at our final theorist, Frederick Jameson, and recap over this whole session.